Welcome to a Theological Dust-Up, hosted by FreeThinking Ministries. I'm Dr. Tim Stratton, and today we're going to discuss one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God. Now, it might surprise you, but I think one of the most important arguments for the existence of God is the ontological argument. I recently made a short 5-minute video about the ontological argument for Frank Turek's YouTube channel. Shortly after shooting the video, and before the video was released, I attended the EPS in Denver, Colorado, the Evangelical Philosophical Society. It's a big conference in Denver this last year where, all these big names attended, all these, very smart philosophers. And I just love attending those conferences just to learn from all of my peers. Well, I listened to a philosopher read a fantastic paper about the ontological argument. And after his talk, a fantastic conversation ensued in the hallway, and we became fast friends. We hung out later that night, and I'll never forget something he said in passing, something like this: whatever you do, don't make any videos about the ontological argument that are only 5 minutes long. And I was like, whoops, I just did that. Well, fortunately, after Frank Turek released the video, this philosopher told me, it wasn't that bad. There was no glaring issues. And I was like, whew, dodged a bullet there. Well, with that said, I've invited this expert in all things related to the ontological argument to join us today to discuss this controversial case for the existence of a maximally great being, an argument for the existence of God. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the show, Phil Kallberg. How you doing, Phil?
I'm doing really well, Tim. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, when you sent me that link saying, hey, this is the video I did, check it out, and I pulled it up, and the first thing I saw is, oh, that's under 5 minutes. I was like, well, crap, I really stuck my foot in my mouth on this one.
Well, I think your point was I think your point is generally true. The ontological argument is not one that should be just, glossed over in just a couple minutes or so.
That's what I was trying to say, but clearly right. I probably should have said it a little better or differently.
No, I thought it was funny. And we're going to talk about this short video today, so we can get into some of the nuances, and maybe you can add why, if you really want to go deep into this argument, why it does necessitate a much longer video, and maybe we can get that done in the future. But before we go any further, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm Phil Kallberg. I'm an adjunct professor of philosophy at Southwest Baptist University here in Bolivar, Missouri. I like to joke that I'm the adjunct philosophy professor there because I'm the only philosophy professor there. I'm married to my wife, Sarah, who's a doctor. We have 3 children, a 6-year-old girl, a 4-year-old son, and a 1-year-old girl. And I got into doing philosophy because there's a much, much longer story about how I went through an existential crisis and things like that, which we don't have time for. I did a podcast on it. It was like an hour and a half long, so I'm not going to do
Wow.
that. But I love doing it. I do it because I enjoy doing this. And I really enjoy teaching, doing philosophy, and love going to conferences and meeting people like yourself and hanging out and having a good time. So,
yeah. Well, not only do we both enjoy philosophy, we both enjoy hard rock music and metal and Metallica. So, show people, make sure people can see your shirt.
A good friend of mine made me this shirt because he's like, you're a philosopher and you like Metallica. So he made me the shirt. And after he made it, I was like, dude, I'm going to have to find a way to wear that while I'm teaching and at a conference. And so then I don't really want to wear a T-shirt to the school because it's, right. It's not that, especially when maybe if I got tenure, I could get away with it, but I don't have that. So what I did is I waited until the class was canceled and we had to do it over Zoom, and I wore it then. And then the next conference I went to, I wasn't presenting the first day, so I just wore the T-shirt the first time. And then when I did present, the guy who was the moderator was like, let me tell you something about Phil. The first day we came to the conference, I sat beside him on the bus, and he was wearing this big shirt that says philosopher. That's who Phil is.
And it doesn't just say philosopher, it says it in the font of Metallica. So
Mm-hmm. That's
yeah, I love it.
that's mostly what makes it cool. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's awesome. Well, we're going to have a philosophical conversation today on the ontological argument. So, give us a brief history of the ontological argument, and then tell us how you began to focus so much of your time on really what's a controversial case for the existence of God.
Okay. It's fair to say that there are ontological arguments instead of one per se, which is the case with all arguments in natural theology. There's multiple versions of the cosmological argument, moral argument, and so on. The original one came from St. Anselm, where he was trying to think of a be-all, end-all argument that would get us everything we want about God, because like the cosmological argument can get you necessity, the moral argument can get you God's moral perfection, but you can't get moral perfection from the cosmological argument. At least I'm unaware of any examples where that would work, and I don't see how it would. And so he came up with this idea that God is the greatest conceivable thing, and that was kind of the thing that started the ball rolling. Now, to my knowledge, I don't think anybody still like defends Anselm's version as saying, yeah, that's a really, really good version of it. No,
Right.
I don't think so. Later on, Descartes gave an ontological argument, and nobody really defends that anymore. The joke I heard people say is Descartes convinced himself of all of his own philosophy and pretty much nobody else. And then basically most philosophers thought this is just a bad argument until around, I want to say about the 1950s, maybe 1960s, when some philosophers of religion looked into the developments in modal logic, which is the logic of possibility and necessity, and realized, oh, wait, we can take what's been applied, we've learned in modal logic, and make ontological arguments for God for this. And that's where you get modal ontological arguments. Now, some scholars like the late Charles Hortzhorn and Norman Malcolm think you can actually find modal versions of it in Anselm if you read him carefully looking for that. That's kind of controversial because it's like, well, Anselm didn't know about modal logic. Was he really doing that? And it gets into a whole other things. But the modal versions are generally agreed to be the best by people who research this. If you want to make an ontological argument, make a modal one. And from the research I've done, what's considered the absolute best one, the gold pinnacle standard, is one that Kurt Gödel gave, and he didn't even like publish it. It was in stuff that got published posthumously. Gödel was like a master logician and probably didn't do it because he was trying to prove God. He was probably just trying to work out the logic of it. But it's also the case that without a great deal of study in modal logic, it's very unlikely you're going to understand that one. So the next best one, everyone agrees, is something along the lines of the version Plantinga gives. And pretty much everybody else who has tried to make a good one since then has done something pretty similar to what Plantinga did. He originally published it in The Nature of Necessity, but I don't recall the date of that off the top of my head. I think it was somewhere in the 60s. So, yeah. And so basically what it's trying to do is say, hey, let's get one argument that gives us God with a capital G, the omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, necessary being. So you can call that the God of the triple O's or the N and the N, or if you're very much anti this type of argument, you could just make it like a screaming no, I guess.
No. So I like how you said that really nobody's defending Anselm's version anymore, but we do have to give him props for getting the ball rolling, right? We're standing on his shoulders, and he first had this concept, or the concept of the right.
I was going to say that's what I think a lot of good philosophy does is somebody gets an idea or an intuition, they try and express it, and then somebody else comes along later and says, well, maybe your intuition is right, but the way you argued for it is wrong, the way you expressed it is bad, and we need to do better and move on. In fact, Plantinga said something similar to that about his evolutionary argument against naturalism, where he says, I think my intuition is, I'm paraphrasing, is kind of spot on, but later people will probably develop this and make it much better than I gave it as.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's move on. I mean, I've just got to tell you that I absolutely love the ontological argument. I know, so many of my friends that are in this field they have a low view, I guess, of the ontological argument, largely because they say it's not convincing. Now,
Oh. Mhm.
you know, and then some I don't think they all think it's a sound argument either. Now, I do think it's a sound argument, and it might not be convincing in the sense that it brings all these atheists to Christ,
Mhm.
but how many arguments do that?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have seen atheists who eventually became Christians who were just really rocked by either the moral argument or the Kalam cosmological argument, even the free thinking argument. But I've never seen a non-believer or an atheist just get rocked by the ontological argument. But with that said, I do think it's a sound argument. I've
Mhm.
heard that some people have left their atheism because of that argument, even if
Oh,
it
I haven't
hasn't
heard
been.
that. That's interesting. Okay.
I mean, I've only heard like one or two
Okay.
philosophers have done so. I can't even tell you their names. I don't even know if that's true. Just what I've
Mm.
heard. um, but here's why I love the ontological argument, because I do think it's a sound argument, and I think it helps Christians think rightly about God. A.W. Tozer explained that it's common for Christians to hold a low view of God. And he says something to the effect that this low view of God that is often advanced by the church is responsible for multitudes of other evils,
Mhm.
multitudes of lesser evils, because we started by thinking incorrectly about God and holding a low
Mm.
view of God. In fact, it's one of the major reasons as to why I reject divine determinism and why I'm so, I'm pretty loud in my arguments
Yeah, yeah.
against this view of divine determinism, or what I call exhaustive divine determinism, that's held by many, if not most, Calvinists. And it's ultimately why I argue for Molinism. As I argue in my book, I believe that Molinism is the best way, if
Mhm.
not the only way, to consistently make sense of God as a maximally great being. But I know some of my open theist friends would argue against that, but that's what I think. That's where I'm at right now. So with all that said, what do you think, Phil? What do you
Oh,
think of my thoughts, and then why do you like the ontological argument?
yeah. This actually ties in with the other question you asked that I forgot to answer, which is why I started
Oh
digging
yeah.
into this. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason, I think, first of all, the fact that you don't find that most people don't find an argument persuasive doesn't mean it's a bad argument.
Right.
That's if it's not quite the ad populum fallacy, it's pretty close. And especially in this case, modal logic is, most philosophers don't actually even learn it other than like a small section in a
Mm,
logic class. These are professional philosophers with doctorates.
yeah.
The people who focus on modal logic more or less always say the logic behind this is sound.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, let me rephrase. The logic behind this is valid, because that's an
Yeah.
important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so for people to say, well, I don't find this persuasive, I don't find it compelling, that shouldn't necessarily dictate whether it's valid or sound. I can give you all kinds of sound arguments that I don't think should convince you of things.
Right. Right.
That doesn't, yeah, persuasiveness is a more of a function of human psychology than it is the logic of the matter. And not that that shouldn't come into play. I mean, you should talk I was talking to my students about this yesterday in relation to things. If I'm standing up in a church talking about apologetics, I'm going to talk very differently about it there than I would if I was at a secular university trying to give a case, because that's just
Mm-hmm.
rhetoric and human psychology.
Yeah.
So what got me fascinated about the ontological argument is, with most arguments from natural theology, I love the cosmological argument, the moral argument, or excuse me, the moral argument, the teleological argument. I think those are all really great. And I know J.P. Moreland has done one, the argument from consciousness, and in
Yeah.
the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, Timothy and Lydia McGrew have one on the argument from religious experience, and I think all that stuff's great. But the logic of all those, that's pretty cut and dried. Like the cosmological argument, the moral argument, nobody really misunderstands what these arguments are trying to do and how they work. Now, they may say they don't work, they may argue against the premises. Okay, fine, but there isn't really a lot of confusion over what the cosmological argument is trying to do. I think
Yeah.
anybody I don't even think you need a basic course in logic to at least grasp where the thrust of that is trying to push you. With the ontological argument, on the other hand, everybody I looked at seemed to not even agree on what it was trying to do or how it was trying to do it. There was just people were like, it was really bizarre. Like there's a great quote from Bertrand Russell where he says something like, it's very, very easy to be convinced that the argument's unsound, but really hard to figure out where it goes wrong. And that's what more or less everybody was saying. And so I thought, well, when I go into grad school, why don't I study this? It's really hard.
Mhm.
People don't know what to do with it. So why don't I try and study it and figure it out? Because if you're going to do philosophy, maybe run after the hardest argument you can find. And maybe you find out there's nothing there and people are blowing smoke, or maybe you find it, oh, this is something really good and people are just misunderstanding it. And in this case, I think this is if it's not, it's definitely a valid argument as far as the logic goes. Now, 95% of the time I want to say it's sound. 5% of the time I still have some doubts on that. But it's definitely logically valid. Of that, I have no doubt whatsoever.
Yeah. Interesting. So what do you think of my thoughts on the importance of the argument for Christians?
Oh, yeah. I think there's definitely something to be said for that, what you're getting at there, where it has theological or maybe soteriological implications where, hey, you already believe in God. What should follow from that if you're really talking about God with a capital G? And this can point to perfect being theology, which is another thing that comes from Anselm, that God is there's different ways of expressing this. Like Anselm said, the greatest thing that can be conceived, maximally great. I don't like the greatest thing that can be conceived because that ties the properties to what I can conceive. And I think God's got better properties than I can conceive. So maximally great is probably a little better. But for the idea as I understand it is for any property that there is, if it's a good thing to have, God has it to the best degree possible. And so like with power, is it better to be able to lift 200 pounds than 100 pounds? Obviously. Is it better to be able to lift 500 than 200? Well, obviously. And you go up and up and up, and eventually you reach whatever the maximum possible amount of power is, and that's what we should attribute to God. And same with benevolence and omniscience and whatever other transcendent categories we'd apply to him. But it's usually those 3 O's and some, I would add necessity as well. So,
Yeah. So I like how you're doing that. You're saying, okay, is it better to love one person or two persons? Is it better to love two persons or 10 persons? Is it better to love 10 persons or everybody? You know, it just seems like, you know, and these are conclusions that we can get apart from this too. It seems biblical that we can make a case for God's perfection and that he is a maximally great being from Scripture alone. We don't need the ontological argument. But then there's debate. I mean, you look at A.W. Pink and he says, no, God does not love everyone. You know, he's a well-known Calvinist theologian. He said, no, God's not, basically saying God's not omnibenevolent. All right. Then you've got other, you know, let me pick on some Calvinists right now. You've got other Calvinists who will say, well, no, not only does not God, or God doesn't love everyone, but I've argued that John Piper inadvertently has argued for, or that God's not omnipotent. He doesn't mean to, but in my book, I discuss why I think he's accidentally done this. And then you've got others from some Calvinists like James White, who will say that God doesn't, he's not omniscient. What he means by omniscience is, or he would at least say that God's not necessarily omniscient, because on his view, God has to determine the truth value to every proposition. So that's all up to God. Well, that means that logically prior to God determining the truth value to every proposition, God literally knows nothing. I think that's a low, right?
That seems to have absurd implications, and maybe he hasn't quite pushed that out as much as he should. So
exactly. And of course, open theists, they don't think that God, you know, knows the future. And if he doesn't know the future, he doesn't know all the possible futures that he could.
They try and get around that though by saying there's no knowledge about the future. So they would. I know some people have said open theists are heretical, and maybe some of them are, but in my mind, I'm like, well, there I don't think we have a disagreement about the nature of God. We have a disagreement about what's nature of the future is. And I don't buy their arguments that you can't have knowledge of the future, because it seems intuitively obvious to me that I do. I knew yesterday that I was going to talk to you today. I had good reasons for it. I was justified. It's true because now I'm talking to you, and I believed it. I had justified true belief that I was going to talk to Tim today. I had knowledge about the future. If I can have it, why can't God?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think, I'm aware of the open theists' arguments. They want to say, no, we do claim that God is omniscient and a
Hmm.
maximally great being. But I also in my book, in this book here, I argue that it is greater for God to be able to, it's greater for God to have middle knowledge than to not have middle knowledge. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but again, they're going to say, well, it's just impossible to have it. So that's where the debate is. So
Hmm.
I'm not trying to throw them under the bus right now. I do know, I'm aware of their arguments against it. But I do think when we think of God as a maximally great being, I say, look, if God is necessarily omnipotent, then he can create humans, he can create creatures with libertarian freedom. He's got that power. If God is necessarily omniscient, then God knows how these free creatures would freely choose if he were to create them, and even if he never does. So therefore, if God is necessarily omnipotent and necessarily omniscient, and the decree is contingent, then God has middle knowledge. Middle knowledge comes along for the ride. So that's one
Hmm.
reason why I'm a Molinist. Definitely not the only reason, but it's a contributing factor.
Yeah,
um,
I do like that. Middle knowledge is one of those things that seems intuitively obvious to me because, again, I have what we would classify as middle knowledge of my wife and my children. I know in certain situations what my wife will and will not do because we've been married almost 9 years. I've known my children their whole life. I know if I put my children in certain situations, they're going to scream and cry and throw a fit because they're
mhm.
children, and I've seen them do it before.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
I can know that about my wife and children, why couldn't God know that about us? That just, again, seems very
Right.
intuitively obvious to me that, yeah, unless middle knowledge is like impossible, logically absurd for some
Yeah.
reason, then of course God
Mhm.
could have it. And
Right.
I've never really heard a good argument as to why it's logically absurd, why it couldn't even exist.
Hmm. Well, I like how you said that. You got counterfactual knowledge.
Hmm.
And if God has counterfactual knowledge prior to creation, then that's middle knowledge. Um, and so I would say the grounding objection is an argument that's brought forth to show the
Yeah.
impossibility
Hmm.
of middle knowledge. But I would just point people to the video that I did with Kirk McGregor a few weeks ago. We discuss his newest book, and he offers 7 objections against the grounding objection.
Mm.
So I'll just point people there for now.
Yeah, that objection was never very terribly impressive to me because it didn't seem to me like it was ever showing this whole concept is incoherent. It was saying, well, whence from it comes, which is a completely different
Yeah,
question to me. And I'm like,
right.
well, even if we can't establish whence from it comes, that doesn't show it's impossible.
Yeah,
I go out in the woods and I find a house that there's no record of anybody building, and like I research all the historical records, and everybody's like really confused how it got there. Well, it doesn't show that it's not there if I can't establish who built it
right.
or why it's there.
Yeah, good. That's really good. So yeah, let me ask you. I don't recall asking you this in Denver. You seem very friendly to middle knowledge
Oh,
and libertarian freedom. Are you a
yeah.
Molinist?
For a long time I thought I was, and then I
Hmm.
came across some more technical objections when I did a podcast for a number of years that I had to suspend about a year and a half ago. And the first thing I did in there was I did a big deal push on the problem of divine foreknowledge. I introduced it, and then I talked to a Calvinist, an open theist, a simple foreknowledge guy, a Molinism guy, and I even got one of my Thomistic friends on there to give me
Yeah.
a view from Aquinas. And then I tried
Uh,
to wrap it all up. And I did hear some objections to Molinism that I thought were good enough where I'm like, I don't know if I can like buy into this 100%,
mhm.
but like the assumptions Molinism needs, like libertarian free will, like counterfactual middle knowledge,
Yeah.
those all seem intuitively right to me.
Mhm.
I'm if I'm not 100% convinced of those, I'm like ultra sympathetic because
Yeah.
the idea that counterfactuals don't exist, oh, that seems pretty close to
Mhm.
absurd to me. I don't see how you can deny some type of free will without somewhat contradicting yourself and so many things like that. So
Yeah.
I I wouldn't be quite comfortable calling myself a Molinist in the good sense, but I'm really, really sympathetic because, like,
Yeah.
I was talking with a guy about this a while back, and he had some objections, and I'm like, I just really want molinism to be true because its base level assumptions are
Right.
just so intuitively obvious.
Yeah.
They just seem to follow. And so, and I'm sure you're going to ask me, well, what were those technical objections? And
I won't do
I
that
can't
now.
recall off the top of my head. I have to go look them up for you. So
Yeah. Maybe in the future we'll do that, but I do want to kind of get this back to the ontological
yeah,
argument. I
mhm.
just felt compelled to to ask that question. And at the end of the day, the last sentence of my book, I argue that mere molinism, the idea that we have libertarian freedom, at least occasionally, and that God has middle knowledge, is the best explanation of all the data,
Yeah.
from all the biblical data, the philosophical data, theological data.
And if that's all you want in mere molinism, I'm with you. And then maybe the other objections are like technical things that we need to figure or work out where this aspect somehow conflicts with this aspect, and we need to reword it or rework it in some way or something like that. Yeah. But no, if that's what you mean by mere molinism, then I'm a mere molinist, and I'm happy to say that.
Cool. Well, technically, what I mean by mere molinism is that in the actual world, we have libertarian freedom, at least occasionally, and that God possessed knowledge of how we would freely choose before he created the actual world.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by mere molinism. But then I argue that it's that those two key ingredients, that it's the best explanation to affirm those two things. We can't prove it with 100% certainty, but I like what you said. We should want it to be true because it really helps us answer so many tough questions.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And and you look at the best objections against it. Well, there's really good objections against those objections, but those best objections against molinism, I would say, are not as bad as the objections we can raise against its rival views.
Yeah.
So it is the best explanation, I think. But anyway,
every theory you have in theology or philosophy is going to have objections that are reasonable enough that it should give you pause. That's just par for the course. So
right. Well said. Okay, so since I do have you here and you focus on the ontological argument, let's. I would love to discuss with you that short little video.
Okay.
That I did for Frank Turek. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to play some of the clips from that video, and then I'll let you respond. So now there's several forms of the ontological argument, and they usually focus on the idea of the possible existence of a necessary and maximally great being, what many consider to be the definition of God. That is to say, is it possible that a necessary and maximally great being exists? Or is there some illogical and incoherent notion about a being who exists necessarily and is omnipotent, perfect in power, omniscient, perfect in knowledge, and omnibenevolent, perfect in love? So what do you think, Phil? Am I on the right track? If so, what would you add?
Yeah, you're on the right track. And the way I would say I know you're on the right track is when I read informed critics, that is people who know what they're talking about, who argue against modal ontological arguments, they almost universally will say God is impossible. They'll say there's, like an easy example is appeal to the problem of evil. There's some incoherence in the idea that there is a God that's omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. Like God either can't know about all the evil, or he can't be powerful enough to do anything about it, or he doesn't care, or something along those lines. Because, well, I mean, the problem of evil is a pretty substantive objection. So that's one of the conclusions you could draw, is there's some incoherence in the concept of God. And so people will either say, hey, you can't, God is impossible. The Christian concept of God has an incoherence lurking in it that we need to pull out. Or occasionally they'll just say, you can't start with the idea of a necessary being. You've got to get there somewhere else, which is a little bit more complicated. It gets into whether things are logically a priori or not, and things along those lines. But yeah, when people want to deny it, they turn around and say, well, God is either impossible, or we just can't start with the possibility of a necessary being alone. We've got to do something else.
Well said. So, I see I interact with people that offer the arguments based upon the problem of evil, whether it be the problem of moral evil, natural evil, gratuitous evil,
Hmm.
the problems of divine hiddenness that John Schellenberg is famous for. I look at all these, and I spend a lot of time trying to answer these. Oh, also with the problem of hell,
Hmm.
saying that the concept of hell is incoherent with the maximally great being. So I see all these arguments really as objections raised against what would turn out to be the first premise of the ontological argument.
Yep.
And I'd love to spend my time showing, you bring Molinism back into this, how Molinism defeats all those arguments. Yeah, you think those, basically we're looking at all these objections against the existence of God as reasons to doubt the first premise of the ontological argument. Do you think that's right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, in my opinion, and I've tried to do some research and study on this, although there are certainly people more knowledgeable than I have, I don't think any of those objections are successful. Now, to be fair, we'd have to spend 2, 3, 4, 5 hours going through all of them and being meticulous, which obviously we don't have time to do. But I don't think they're successful. But that kind of response is, if you want to be logical and rational about it, it's the correct response, is to say, okay, well, but the Christian concept of God is impossible. Maybe we could have a God with a small g that's only omniscient and omnipotent, but not omnibenevolent, or something like that. So
Right. Yeah, I agree. Well, let's look at this next section of the video, which actually lays out one version of the argument. So here it is. The argument usually looks something like this. Premise 1. It is possible that God, a maximally great being, exists. 2. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. 4. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. 5. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists. The ontological argument is logically valid and really comes down to the first premise, as the others follow from the rules of modal logic. All right, so Phil, I mentioned that there are multiple versions of the ontological argument. Can you discuss these multiple versions? You did mention it a little bit in the introduction, but talk about it a little more, and then tell us which one you prefer. And then, first, I guess, answer this. Is the version that I offered acceptable?
And acceptable in the sense that it's logically valid? Sure.
Okay.
I would say it also kind of depends on what you're trying to do. Like if you and I were having an academic debate at like ETS or EPS, I would say, give me one more academic than that. If you're giving a more popular level presentation in a church or something like that, then yeah, go with that, because that does a reasonably decent job of trying to somewhat explain the concept of possible worlds as well as present the argument, because you have to understand how philosophers use possible worlds in order to understand the argument, at least the modal versions anyway. And that one, the way it kind of lays it out, it walks you through that instead of just assuming that people know that. And well, I know you talk about possible worlds quite a bit because you're like, it fits very well with Molinism.
That's right.
Are the people who listen to your podcast already pretty familiar with that, or?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So we don't need to go in depth on that. Okay. As I said, if you really, really want to go for the most high, like technically sophisticated one, go with Kurt Gödel's, which I don't remember off the top of my head. Again, I'd have to look it up for you. Anselm's one was God's the greatest conceivable being. A being that actually exists in the real world as opposed to just in your head is greater. Therefore, God actually exists, which again, nobody actually defends that anymore. Everybody says, he had an insight, but the way he expressed it was so bad and messy that we can just kind of dismiss that. And Plantinga has two versions of it. He has a simplified one and a more complicated one.
Can you share those with us?
The simplified one, he gave that in, I want to say, was it God, Freedom, and Evil? Hang on, let me look it up. It was in God, Freedom, and Evil. And the simplified one is, there is a possible world in which maximal greatness is instantiated, which means it really is there. Next, necessarily, a being is maximally great only if it has maximal excellence in every world. And necessarily, a being has maximal excellence in every world only if it has omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection in every world. So, if the first premise is true, then there is a possible world W such that if it had been actual, there would have existed a being that was omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect, and this being, furthermore, would have had those qualities in every possible world. So it follows that if W had been actual, it would have been impossible that there is no such being, which is, I'm sure you can see, logically speaking, that's virtually identical to what you just said. He just said it in more academic language that kind of assumes we understand more of the terms and the logic going on, where the version you give, I think, is much better for people who haven't already studied modal logic, because they'll maybe not quite grasp what's going on intuitively, but it does a much better job of laying it out. Where with this thing, if I'm talking to people, I'm going to have to explain all these logical concepts and all. I'm going to have to do about 30 or 40 minutes of groundwork before I actually give the argument.
So this would be a good one for those maybe new to philosophy and apologetics, maybe for those going to Frank Turek's YouTube channel.
The one that you gave, you mean?
Yeah, right.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I would say even people who don't think it works, you should study this, because lurking behind this, there's all kinds of questions like, what is possible worlds? Is that just a semantic tool? Or like the late David Lewis said, are they really, really out there? Which seems absurd to me, but somebody actually argued that. And what does it mean to have existence? And how could existence be necessary? Lurking behind it is all these like assumptions about metaphysics that they're questions you have to answer, so to speak, if you really want to think seriously about these things.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go back to the video here. So even if an atheist doesn't think that God probably exists, if one affirms that there is even the smallest of chances that they could be wrong because the concept of God is logically possible, then God exists. In fact, Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists in the world, has provided all the evidence we need to see that God exists. Dawkins has famously proclaimed, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." With those words in mind, here's what I call Richard Dawkins's ontological argument. Premise 1. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. 2. Therefore, it's possible that God, a maximally great being, exists. 3. If it's possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. 4. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. 5. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. 6. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists. 7. Therefore, God exists. Thank you, Richard Dawkins. Now, some think that this argument is too easy or too good to be true. However, this argument only seems to work with the concept of a maximally great being, as all parodies of this argument have been shown to fail, such as a maximally great pizza.
Well, couldn't you have a parallel argument for the greatest possible pizza? No, because the notion of a greatest possible pizza is logically incoherent. A greatest possible pizza would be metaphysically necessary in its existence, and therefore it could not be eaten. And therefore it couldn't be a pizza, because the pizza couldn't be eaten.
Well, that gets my attention and provides further reason to think that a maximally great being, God, really does exist. All right, Phil. Well, that was a short video on the ontological argument, but it was, it wasn't meant to be a maximally great video. It was merely meant to get people's feet wet and to show what we mean really by the first premise. I wanted to help folks understand the difference between possible and impossible. So do you think I succeeded even a little bit?
Yeah. And a maximally great one, and that would have to be so long, it would be really impractical. So yeah. Although maybe the fact that it was so long would mean it's not maximally great, because the maximally great one would be like hyper efficient in its use of time, which I don't know quite how to pull off.
So maybe it was a maximally great being.
I guess we should leave that possibility open.
Yeah.
So, no, I think you succeeded there, and that's something that like when I'm teaching logic or epistemology to my students, I try and stress there's a big difference between plausibility and possibility.
Yeah,
and so
right.
if you're whether like it's good rhetoric what you used with Dawkins there, and I wonder if we pushed him if he would back off on that.
Yeah.
I don't know, but like, yes, if you're going to concede, oh, it's possible that God exists, and even if you're saying it's a 1% possibility, even if it's like a 0.00001%, and you're willing to let me define God as a maximally great being, I can run the ontological argument all day, because how plausible something is not really, it's not at all the same thing as how possible it is. There's all kinds of possible things that are extraordinarily implausible. It's extraordinarily implausible that anybody actually could have won the lottery when it was well over $1 billion, like a month and a half ago, because the odds of you winning if you bought a ticket were like 1 in almost 300 million. 1 in 300 million is an extraordinarily implausible event, but it's not impossible, because 1 in 300 million can happen. And I believe somebody actually did win. So yeah. And so that's why I think I mentioned this before, why the people who really understand how this argument works turn around and they don't say, oh, God is implausible. That I think it's more likely than that he doesn't exist, which if you're epistemically conservative, you might think, well, that's kind of a reasonable response. The people who understand this argument turn around and say, no, God is impossible, at least if they want to be an atheist or something along those lines.
Yeah. All right. So that brings us to a paper that you've written on how the ontological argument can be used against agnosticism. And, you know, I appreciate, you know, I mean, there's so many atheists today that say, well, it's just a lack of belief in God. And it really turns out to be the way they see atheism is this weird form of agnosticism, really. I don't know why they don't embrace the label agnosticism. But the atheists, you know, I've got some atheist friends, Ben Watkins, for example. I really appreciate him because he realizes, no, we can't just say atheism is a lack of belief. We have to say, no, God does not exist, and here's why. And like I said earlier, he's going to really focus on the problem of evil, the problem of hell, the problem of divine hiddenness, and he does.
And that's intellectually respectable. I can give him some respect for that.
Amen to that. And I do think all of his arguments fail at the end of the day. But wow, I have to, you know, say, hey, let's give props to Ben here, because he's doing some intellectually heavy work. He's not just, you know, affirming this weak definition of it's just a lack of belief that I had, you know, and he would be the first to tell his atheist friends and colleagues to stop doing that, to stop saying that atheism is merely a lack of belief, because he wants to argue, no, ontologically, God does not exist. Where just having a lack of belief is just talking about your personal subjective belief state in psychology. Well, who cares?
That's at best. I would actually say people who say that need to take a course in logic, because a good definition is something that includes all the things that are that thing and excludes everything else. And that's something you learn in basic logic. A good definition of a tree includes everything that's a tree and everything that excludes everything that is not a tree. Well, if atheism is a lack of belief, trees, rocks are atheists. Probably dogs and cats are atheists too, although it's a little harder to say about them because I'm not sure what they do and do not believe. But you're clearly including things by that definition that are not atheists, which therefore it follows that's a bad definition. And that's basic logic that you should, if you took a logic class and your professor didn't explain to you how definitions work, you got cheated. So
Well, I just got to say that I think my dog looks at me as a maximally great being. But I don't think any cat would ever look at any human as a maximally
cat great. Definitely does not. A cat thinks they're the ruler of the universe. No doubt about that.
That's right. Okay, well, so that paper, I read a paper that you have read at a couple different philosophy conferences now on how the ontological argument can be used to help get the agnostic off the fence, as it were. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. So what I've argued is, let's consider what we've talked about with the argument for now. Put aside whether or not it establishes God, just for the sake of argument, bracket that off.
Mm-hmm.
What can we learn from it with that bracketed off? Well, nobody who's really informed about modal logic and these arguments denies that the logic works. It depends on the modal axiom S5. There's 5 axioms of modal logic. S1 through S3 are not controversial at all. Almost nobody doubts S4. Some people do doubt S5, which is the one modal ontological arguments use, although they're in the vast minority. And when you dig into the reasons why, most of them it's because the modal ontological argument makes use of it. So they're trying to find a way to undo it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got to stop you right here, if you don't mind. I doubt most of our viewers will know what these S numbers are.
Uh-huh.
Can you briefly explain that, and especially talk about S5 and why it's controversial?
Okay, modal logic is just the study of the logic of the relationship between possibility, necessity, and impossibility and how they relate. And I honestly don't recall off the top of my head what S1 through S4 are at the top of the moment, because they're uncontroversial. Like when I teach modal logic to my students, nobody gives a hoot about those things. It's just, as soon as we start talking about possibility and necessity, these things are just obvious. And so it's not quite the same, but it's a little equivalent to like when Aristotle wrote out the 3 basic rules of logic: the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, and the law of the identity. It's not exactly the same because modal logic actually depends on those, but it's kind of similar to that. And so they aren't axioms in the sense that, oh, we're just assuming these to make things work. They're axioms in the sense that the logicians who studied this said, oh, what we've found when we study these are the basic principles at work in things. And S5 says that the possibility of necessity entails actual necessity. You can't have, as soon as it's possible that something is necessary, it really is necessary. And so therefore it actually really is, because something that's necessary cannot fail to obtain. If that might be a little confusing to people who aren't familiar with modal logic, though, the way I had to say that.
Could we say, since it's possible that 1 + 1 = 2, it's necessary that 1 + 1 = 2? Can we do that?
If you think that math is necessary, which is math is a very good candidate, then that would follow. And if we want to argue about that, that gets into a whole other big thing with God and abstract objects, which, just for the sake of argument, if your numbers and math are a very, very good candidate for necessary things, at least necessary abstract objects. At the least, they're a good candidate, irregardless of all the other stuff. So
right. Okay. Do you have any other candidates in mind besides God?
The only other thing that I could think of that, well, for like something that's necessary existing, the only other candidate that could be possible would be universals, in the sense of like the color blue or the color white or something like that.
Well, what about the laws of logic? Would those be universals?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know quite how I would argue for that, but they'd be pretty good candidates too. So that's a good catch. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Well, cool. All right, so I kind of interrupted you there and asked you to talk about S5. So feel free to get back on your train of thought.
There are. It's also important to keep in mind that there are several different things that we mean when we say necessity. There are different types of necessity. There's logical necessity, which is a thing that most people are going to be familiar with it, which is if you have a good deductive argument, if A then B, A so B, that's logical necessity. You have the premises, it's a valid argument, therefore necessarily the conclusion follows. It can't fail to obtain if you have the premises. There's a stronger version called metaphysical necessity, which is what if God, a maximally great being, really does exist, that's what he would fall into. Not he, excuse me. There's other weaker types of necessity where, like, how did he put it? Plantinga gave an example of, like, is it possible that Voltaire ever swam the Atlantic Ocean? Well, we would want to say no, but we're like, well, come on, is there something contradictory or obviously incoherent about the idea that a human being could swim the Atlantic Ocean? No, it doesn't entail an impossibility, but come on, we know humans don't do those kind of things. And so there's a weaker type of necessity like that as well. And then some people even try to go further in that. And so what this is saying is, in many senses, necessity is a binary thing. It's on or off. Something either is necessary or it's not. It doesn't come in degrees. Like the color black, or most colors, they come in degrees. I could lighten this up quite a bit until it was the same. It was as white as your shirt, and there's all kinds of degrees in there. In fact, arguably, there might even be infinite degrees in between there. It has a gradient. Necessity is binary. It's just on or off. There's no degrees in between there. And because of that, it just follows logically that as soon as it's possible something is necessary, it is, because there's no degrees. Are you tracking with me? Is that making sense?
Yeah, I think it's similar. You know, when I argue against determinism and for libertarian freedom, I'll say something like this: that antecedent conditions are either sufficient or insufficient to necessitate all events. So I'm trying to make that a binary thing. Is that
oh yeah, you're trying to do the same thing. And then maybe somebody would want to argue against you and say, oh, it's not necessarily binary, but you're trying to do the same thing and say it's either this or it's that. And there are examples in the world where people do that, and it's not really the case at all. Like the one I love is people tell me, you have to vote for the Democrat or the Republican. And I'm like, no, I don't. There are other political parties. I cannot vote. I could write in my wife's name. I don't have to do either of those. That's a false dilemma. It's not binary in America, even though so many people want us to claim it is. Whereas necessity, it is binary. It either is or it's not. And if it's not, it's probably impossible. Like I'm not aware of anybody who's like argued that, hey, if you come up with something that's necessary and it isn't possible, then we could just kind of downgrade it to possibility alone. But I don't know, maybe somebody will try someday. So no, it's with necessity, it either is, it entails, or it does not. It's impossible. I think Hartshorne said something like, with the modality of necessity, we can only conceive of actuality or impossibility. There is no middle ground therein. And I'm paraphrasing him if anybody looks up the quote.
So an impossibility would be a triangle with four corners, or a married bachelor.
Basic things like that. And the general rule of thumb for modal logic in figuring out if something is necessary is if its contrary is impossible. So if you take your idea X and say, is the contrary impossible? Well, then it's necessary. And you can see that if you apply it to deductive arguments. Is it possible that if A, then B, A, so B is not the case? Well, no. Then you know it's impossible. Then you know the argument, at least the logic of it, is necessary.
Okay. Good.
Are you tracking with me? Is that all making sense?
Yeah. I'm tracking with you. So, all right. So how do you use this argument to help get the agnostics off the fence? Go one way or the other. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what I did when I was writing for the master's program I took is I developed an argument that I call the ontological argument against agnosticism, or the OAAA, which is I thought was a clever abbreviation at the time. And it's like, okay, so consider God, the maximally great being, per perfect being theology that we've been talking about. There's two broad categories you can put him in. He's possible or he's impossible. And that seems perfectly intuitive. Everything falls into those categories. And we can argue, like, some people might have reasonable disagreements over what is or is not impossible. Like, I loved for a long time using the example of the sound of one hand clapping is incoherent. It's because you need two hands to clap. And then I said that in class one day, and one of my students held up her hand and did this. And said, no, so we weren't disagreeing about the categories. We were disagreeing about what belongs in the categories.
Well, the best thing I've heard is beware of one hand clapping. And if you ever see somebody walking around just doing this, you should be wary of that person.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. Exactly. So anyhow, given that, I lost my train of thought. Okay, yeah, possible or impossible. Now, if God is impossible, then of course he cannot exist. And you have to be a strong atheist. You have to be a stronger atheist than Richard Dawkins is, where you're saying, not only is it not the case that, I'm not claiming God is improbable or that he's unlikely. I'm claiming he cannot exist. There's a contradiction buried somewhere in the concept of the Christian God. And the best appeals you could probably make there would be something like the problem of divine hiddenness, or the problem of evil, something along those lines. At least that's where I think you would get the most route. And then if God is possible, it follows necessarily that he must exist. Not in the sense that I'm saying, oh, I think it's more likely than not that he exists, or I'm mostly persuaded that he exists, or like I said earlier about the argument, 95% of the time, I think the ontological argument is sound. Well, no, it can't follow that 95% of the time I think God exists, at least not putting aside psychological states. No, he must exist. It's impossible that he not exist. So that's like, for lack of a better term, ultra strong theism.
So I like how you're saying that 95% of the time you think the ontological argument is sound. So if that's the case, I mean, you're willing to bury your stake in the ground and defend it until somebody can show you why it's much more than 5% of the time.
I meant like 5% of the days I wake up, I have doubts about it, and then 95% of the time I don't.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I mean, doubts pass through our minds on a lot of things that we shouldn't doubt.
Oh,
but
that's true. Yeah,
I like the fact that I mean, I advance this free thinking argument pretty hard. And do I ever have doubts about it? Of course, I do. But most of the time I'm like, yeah, this is a really good argument, and so I'm willing to put my stake in the ground and argue for it and defend it. And I need somebody to show me why it fails. And until that happens, I'm going to keep fighting for it. That doesn't mean that I'm 100% certain.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
Yeah,
I misunderstood you then. Okay.
Yeah.
No problem.
Is that how you feel about the ontological argument?
Yeah. And so the last step I make in that is here, let me look it up so I can just read it instead of going off of memory, because I got it right here. That's probably a better idea. So, okay. So it's either possible or impossible that God exists. If it's possible that God exists, then God must exist, and that's per the logic of valid forms of the Modal ontological argument. If it's impossible for God to exist, then God cannot exist. Therefore, the only tenable positions with respect to God, as long as we define him as a maximally great being, are either theism, that is, God exists, or a strong atheism, God cannot exist. And arguably, we should probably classify that theism as something like strong theism, because I think if you talk to your average person who claims to believe in God, they probably wouldn't say God is something that cannot fail to exist. They'd probably say something like it's more likely than not that he exists, and that issue is more an issue of how we classify things rather than the logic of it.
Yeah.
So the primary premises there are 1, 2, and 3. It's possible or impossible. If it's impossible for God to exist, then he cannot exist. And then 2 is the only controversial one. If it is possible that God exists, then God must exist. But see, I don't need a sound ontological argument for that to work. I only need the validity of the argument, which virtually everyone who studies it concedes that. I only found one person when I did a survey on this who doubted that modal axiom S5, which those things depend on, is the valid way to do it. And he conceded I'm in the minority when he was trying to find a way to argue against it. So
really?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want people to hear that. You don't need the ontological argument to be sound. You only need it to be valid in order to get the agnostic off the fence.
Yeah, for my OAAA to work, I don't need it to be sound. You can doubt the possibility of God. You can argue. You can think the problem of evil disproves God, and the argument still works. It just then says to you, pushes you to where you should be a strong atheist and say God's impossible.
Wow. All right. So really, this is an argument that both Christians and atheists could advance.
I think so. Now, I've given it at 2 secular philosophy conferences, one in Minnesota and one in Kentucky. When I gave it at the one in Kentucky, it was to other philosophers who are have graduate degrees and are professors, and they all liked it. They thought there's really something here. The one in Minnesota was mostly to a bunch of undergraduate students, and they clearly did not understand what was going on. I could tell from their questions afterwards. And in fact, they kind of got a bit hostile about it. But
Really?
that's in part because I don't think they understood what was going on.
Yeah.
So, however, I will say there is one way that maybe you could find a way, an agnostic could find a way out, which is they could say, okay, I'm going to give you your argument. And the example I use in the essay is, this is equivalent to if there's a binary light switch in a room on the other side of the world, okay? And by binary, I mean it can only be on or off. Obviously, if we want to be fussy about it, we can be like, what if somebody's holding the light switch just in between? But for the sake of argument, it's just binary, okay?
Right.
So the agnostic could give me that, be like, well, we know the light switch must be on or off, but how am I supposed to make a decision on which one it is? And so they could make a similar move with God and say, well, okay, I'll grant you God must exist or he's impossible. But how am I supposed to have the knowledge to decide which? And
would that be like saying it's binary? There's either an even or odd amount of stars in the universe.
Yeah.
But how the heck do I know which one it is?
Yeah,
I'm not in a position. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And there I would then turn around and say, well, okay, but you're basically appealing to your own ignorance at that point. You're saying, I don't have enough information to decide. And I want to try and do some more work in this because it gets a little dicier and a bit more difficult. But it seems intuitively obvious to me, at some point, you should have enough information where you're going to say, one of these is just intuitively a better option to me than the other one. Now, the example I use in the essay is I say, oh, let's take a 19-year-old college freshman who's never even taken philosophy classes, and he gives me the argument. And then he says, I don't have enough knowledge to make a decision. Well, part of me is sympathetic to that.
Right.
The strictly Christian guy in me who likes natural theology wants to be like, but come on. But at the same time, part of me is a little sympathetic to somebody who's going to say, hey, I haven't studied any of this. I don't know anything. Yeah. But then I would turn around and say, but my word, you better study this at this point if you're going to give me this argument, because it's a pretty important call. And then, like I said, take somebody who's in their late 70s, who's got 2 PhDs in philosophy, religion, and theoretical physics, and is an expert. And if that person gives me the argument and says, I don't have enough knowledge to make a judgment call, I'm going to be pretty suspicious of that he's really telling me the truth at that point. So, yeah.
Good point.
Now, where the demarcation is, that's a whole other hard question. But I do think even if I'm willing to even granting the person who wants to be agnostic, okay, you've got at least a plausibly valid distinction there between what is and what you know about it, which certainly seems obvious. Then you're going to have to keep appealing to your own ignorance, and that should have diminishing returns. Because especially when you're dealing with questions of whether a maximally great being exists, whether the God of the universe who created us all exists, it should be on you to try to go at least plausibly figure this out to some degree. And if you're not actively seeking information about it or trying, that's not good. Like that a friend of yours, Ben, you mentioned, it seems to me, from what you say, it seems like, okay, he's trying to pursue information about this. Now, sounds like he's making arguments I wouldn't like, but at least it seems to me he's in the process of trying to do the right thing based on the argument.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I respect him so much. In fact, this organization I work for, Maven, we take high school and college students sometimes around the country, and we'll send them 6 weeks of training material before we go to our destination. I'll fly and meet them somewhere, and then we bring local atheists. We try to get philosophers if we can. But at least somebody from the local freethinkers group, not to be confused with FreeThinking Ministries, the local atheist freethinkers group. And we'll try to get somebody to come talk to them. We say, hey, convince the students that atheism is true. And we've invited Ben to speak to our students in the past. And I got to tell you, he provides the most homework for us because his arguments are philosophically rigorous. I will say he hasn't convinced any of the students, but that's because we prepared them well. but he really made me work really hard, and it's made me a better thinker because of his arguments. It really has. It's developed so much of what I've worked on since then. So I really appreciate thinkers like him, even if we see things differently. But I think ultimately you're saying the more you study, the more one does their due diligence, you got to come down on one side of the fence or the other. So get off the fence.
Yeah, and I guess I should mention there is another way you could deny it, which is to deny modal logic per se. But no, you should not. Should not do that. That's it's not quite as well established as Aristotle's 3 rules of logic because they've got more longevity, but it's about as well as established as any system of logic can be. So you should not do that. Although I guess in theory you could, but no, don't do that.
It's not like they contradict the 3.
It's like an abstraction up from Aristotle's 3 basic rules. At least I find it that way. Maybe some other people would disagree, but yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that they're based upon them.
I think so. Yeah, that's, and I also think that with modal logic, you can explain these concepts in normal words. You don't have to resort to symbolic logic. Like if you get a modal logic textbook, it's going to be using symbolic logic like mad. But you can explain these concepts normally, like I attempted to do here. And maybe I didn't do a good job, but you can at least. And that's part of the sign of a good principle is if you can explain it just in normal everyday speech.
Right. No, I think there's value with symbolic logic, but I'm not good at it. I can map out like the moral argument, symbolically. But
I tell my students when I teach them that, I'm like, if you're reading a good philosopher who's using symbolic logic, he'll write it out in symbolic logic, and then he'll explain it to you in normal words. Right. If he doesn't do that, maybe be suspicious he's trying to hide something in the symbolic logic, or nobody's taught him that that's a better way to do it. So,
most of the arguments that I do advance, in journal articles or even in a lot of my blogs, I'll send it to my colleague in South Africa named Jacobus Erasmus, and I like to joke that he dreams in symbolic logic. And I'm like, well, will you make sure that this argument is structurally valid? By mapping it out symbolically, and he does it in 10 seconds and sends it back to me. And all right, no, he's really good at it. So, but yeah, it's just a nice way to kind of proof what you've already said in English or whatever you're.
It's very useful for that. But when I use it, I've got to have like a key up right over here as I'm going through working everything out. So yeah.
All right. Well, since we're talking about your papers, just briefly give us some highlights or the thesis of what you talked about in Denver when it came to the.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I got my master's from a Catholic school. And so virtually all of my professors were Thomistic philosophers because, hey, if you're Catholic and you're into philosophy, you're going to love Aquinas. I joke that I've met a few people who say they're Thomists, that is into Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, who are not Catholic, but I don't think I've ever met a Catholic who's into philosophy who is not a Thomist.
Wow.
Which is I'm okay with that. Thomas Aquinas was an amazing philosopher. He was probably the greatest one, maybe since like Socrates, Aristotle, or Plato, and so. That's cool. I have other issues with Thomism, but not because Aquinas was not a great philosopher. He was, no doubt about that. Yeah.
So in my book, I spilled more ink on Aquinas than I did on Molina. I think the chapter on Aquinas is 1 or 2 pages longer than the one on Molina. But I think, in some senses of the word, it depends on what one means by that. I could consider myself a Thomist, but I don't think most Thomists would accept me because I'm a Molinist, and a lot of
they don't like Molinism at all.
So, right. Yeah. Now I do know some Thomists who also affirm mere Molinism, but I don't think they're kind of scoffed at by their fellow Thomists as well. But ultimately, you talk about Catholic philosophers. The way I understand it is the Pope at some point had to step in and say, hey, look, a good Catholic can be either a Thomist or a Molinist. I don't know the details on that. I could be wrong, but I think the Pope actually had to get involved at some point. But somebody can fact check me.
I know they declared Aquinas the doctor of the church in the sense that, hey, if you're looking for sound teaching in philosophy and theology, go to Aquinas, is what the Catholic Church says.
Interesting.
Which is a large part of the reason why, if you're a Catholic interested in these things, you're going to be a Thomist, because, hey, that's what the church is telling you to do. So anyhow, since I wanted to write about ontological arguments, and I'm at a Catholic school being taught by Thomists, I had to deal with Aquinas's objections to the ontological argument, because that was what my interlocutors were continually bringing up. And after I got done reading and researching and writing all this stuff, I realized, you know what? Virtually nobody who's in contemporary discussion of ontological argument since about the 50s or 60s ever mentions Aquinas, like very, very rarely. And if they do, it's in passing and not related to much of what's going on. Maybe you could find an exception or two, but it's extremely rare if you can. And pretty much all the Thomists I talked to and read just dismissed the ontological argument out of hand. They're like, because Aquinas didn't like the ontological argument. He gave a bunch of objections to it. But he was also responding to Anselm's version, not contemporary versions. And you can't fault him for that. I mean, modal logic wasn't even developed until like 500 years or so. Maybe if I got my dates a little wrong. About 600 years after Aquinas lived. So you can't fault him for that.
That's like being mad at Aquinas for not driving a Tesla.
Exactly. Yeah. Which some people would do nowadays, but still, you shouldn't do that. And so it occurred to me as I went through and researched all this out, I'm like, Aquinas' objections are actually, if you read him a little charitably, you could apply them to contemporary versions, because he more or less says, hey, not everybody understands the terms you're using in the same way you do, Anselm. Okay, well, you can make that objection to most arguments. I mean, you can get around it by being careful, but yeah, that's a fair objection to any argument if people give it too quickly or a little too flippant or something like that. And then he more or less says he gives it's kind of a more technical objection, but he says you can't start a priori from the idea of a necessary being and then turn around and prove it. So, and that's very much like what some people do when they deny the first premise of the modal ontological argument, say God is not possible. Now, Aquinas, and he made a third objection, which is, I'm not going to be able to quote him per se, but he said something along the lines of, hey, the very possibility of God, if you define him as a maximally great being, and of course he didn't use those terms, is exactly what will not be granted by people who understand this argument, which again is exactly what a lot of it is going on today. And so I gave this essay because I'm like, well, these two groups aren't really interacting with each other. And Aquinas' objections seem, well, I don't think they work, but they're substantive. They're educated, they're informed, they're worth considering. And I think they should give a proponent of ontological arguments pause enough where I'm like, well, I need to find a way to respond to that at least. Yeah. So it was more of a research thing than where I was arguing for anything, but I just don't see anybody else doing anything as far as bringing those two groups into interacting with each other, because contemporary proponents of the modal ontological argument don't turn around and read Aquinas. And again, why would you do that? He predates it by 600 years. I don't blame them for that. And Thomists, for the most part, just assume all the versions of the ontological argument are essentially the same as what Anselm gave, and Aquinas said it's bad, therefore we can just dismiss it. So
So what do you think the greatest objection against the modal ontological argument is?
The best one I've ever came across, ironically, comes from Richard Swinburne, who is a excellent Christian philosopher theist. And he says, okay, if I give you all this, then you have to argue for or defend some seemingly absurd propositions, like, if God is metaphysically necessary, then it really is the case that, how did he put it? It's impossible that there's a state where no one knows everything about the past. God is omniscient. He should know everything about the past. So I have to turn around and argue there is no possible world where no one knows everything about the past. The problem with that is, if you just look at the statement by itself, no one knows everything about the past, that seems perfectly coherent. There's nothing about that inherently seems impossible, incoherent, or that you're making a mistake. And so Swinburne uses that to argue that no, I don't. He actually says God is not metaphysically necessary. He thinks God is logically necessary, but not metaphysically necessary. And he doesn't like the ontological argument for those reasons.
What's he say? How does he distinguish between God being logically necessary, but not metaphysically necessary?
I've tried to understand that a little bit better, but I don't think I quite do. Swinburne kind of throws a little bit of a wrench into my OAAA because he's clearly a Christian theist. But how can I put this? From the pure logic of it alone, he fits in that fine, because he says, okay, I'm going to tell you that a metaphysically necessary God is impossible, which is what his argument is doing. So that part works fine. That doesn't disrupt the logic of it. Now, as far as how I categorize people, then I've got a problem, because there's no sense in which Richard Swinburne is an atheist, much less a strong one. I mean, come on. Yeah. So that throws a bit of a wrench in things. But as far as the logic of it goes, he's giving me that, because he's saying, the maximally great being, as you defined it, when it includes metaphysical necessity, is impossible. So that works fine. The other part, I still haven't quite figured out what to do with yet.
Wait, so he would still say the argument is valid?
I read him on the subject, and I never actually heard him say the argument is valid. But the objection he gives, I would say, kind of tacitly admits the validity of it, because he's just denying the possibility premise. Yeah. Now, right. So I don't know if he would, if we talked to him about that, if he would actually say that or how he would do it. But just looking at the way he gives his objection, I think he's tacitly admitting the validity of the logic at work therein. Because if all you object to is the premise of an argument, well, you're kind of tacitly admitting the logic of it. Now, again, to be fair, maybe you've only got 5 minutes and you only had time to object to the premise and not the actual logic. I don't know.
Well, Swinburne is amazing, but I
definitely,
he's definitely not infallible. And I've found some things that I disagree with, things that he said that I think are wrong and can provide good reason. I can argue for my position, but I do have to say that the vast majority of the time he seems to get things right.
Oh yeah, yeah. And in fact, I would say even the way he categorizes that, part of me is like, that's almost admitting the OAAA argument that I want to make, because he's saying, look, you want to claim God is metaphysically necessary. You have to turn around and claim or defend these seemingly ridiculous or absurd propositions like it's impossible that no one knows everything about the past. And I'm like, okay, fine. I'm willing to give you that. You want to claim that God is impossible. Well, you've got to turn around and do more or less the same thing in the other direction. And it actually, I would argue, puts kind of a big onus on both theists and atheists, where we both got to argue for some seemingly very difficult propositions. Defending the idea that no one knows everything about the past is very, very difficult. But I would say defending the idea that God is impossible is clearly very, very difficult, because people have been trying to do that for hundreds of years at least. And very, very educated, smart, intelligent people have been trying to do that. And to the best of my knowledge, as somebody who's read about this and is reasonably educated, I think they've all failed. So that's clearly very difficult to do too. And the OAAA says you've got to pick one or the other and defend or argue for very strong, difficult to defend propositions.
Yeah, well said. Well, so the ontological argument basically comes down to if it's even possible for a maximally great and necessary being to exist, then a maximally great and necessary being does exist.
Yep, pretty much.
Yeah, so that's just, I'll never forget the first time philosopher said that to me. I was on the phone driving, talking to him. And this is probably, a dozen years ago now or so, when I first started getting into this field. And he was also a pastor in the area. And he said something like, well, if it's even possible that God exists, then he must exist. And I about wrecked my car. Because I was like, exactly. What are you talking about? And he's like, oh, you're not aware of Plantinga's argument? Like, no, I'm not. And so I started studying it, and it just blew my mind. I mean, it took a while to start understanding those key concepts. But once I just even got just a little bit of a hold of it, I remember it just kind of shook me and knocked me backwards almost, because I saw how powerful it was, because it did seem that the argument was valid, and it seemed like the premises were probably true. And then it hit me that you really can't make that argument for for the maximally great pizza,
No,
or all these
no,
other
yeah.
parodies, they fall apart. And so I'm like, well, if God is really the top candidate for this, maybe you could do it with mathematics and things like that. But which I think
Yeah.
some people would
Maybe.
argue those are grounded in God's nature as well,
Mhm.
or in his mind or something like that. But really God is the only thing, the ontological kind of thing. I mean,
Mhm.
especially if you don't think abstract objects exist.
If you're like a nominalist in some sense, yeah.
Yeah, like you take William Lane Craig's approach.
Mhm.
God would be the only ontological kind of concrete thing that you could do that with. And I think that, that really gets my attention. And I've used it. I've never seen it by itself knock an atheist back, but I've used it in a cumulative case, as Dr. Craig has done. After I
Mhm.
give the kalam, I have this one blog article that what do I call it? The Ontological Argument.
Oh.
And where I start off with the kalam, and I say, okay,
Mhm.
is this concept possible? Even if the kalam doesn't move you to
Oh,
theism,
yeah.
does it show you that the concept is possible? And as soon as they say, yeah, it's at least possible, then I give the ontological argument. Or if I give, I might start with the moral argument or any of the other arguments for God, and then give the ontological argument. And I've seen that be effective.
Yeah, there was somebody at EPS trying to do something very like that. I forget the gentleman's name, but the title of his essay was, "If the free will defense works, then God exists." And
how did I miss that?
Yeah, I was like, okay, this seems cool. But then like 2 minutes into it, I realized, oh, he's just using the ontological argument. He's saying that if the free will defense works, then God is possible. Therefore, I can run the modal ontological argument and God exists. And I was like, oh, this is great. Now, I had a few technical quibbles with him because I love these things. But for the most part, what he was doing, I'm like, yeah, this is spot on. I would be like, I think you should have phrased this a little differently here, maybe made this point stronger. But I'm like, yeah, this is good. I think you're pushing things in the right direction. Yeah. I wish I could remember the gentleman's name, but because it was a really good essay. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'll have to send you the link to the ontological argument.
Sounds cool.
That's actually where I first wrote about the Richard Dawkins version of the ontological argument. Wrote it several years ago now, but yeah, I'm sure there's things that I'd want to change. Sure, there's things in it now that you would want to tighten down and make more technical and precise.
Oh yeah. When I wrote my thesis, I had to come up with a conclusion. So I said, this argument begs the question. And that was because I was running out of time and had to come up with a conclusion. And I don't think that's the case at all now. It was more like I couldn't make up my mind what I wanted to, whether I thought it worked or not. And I was under a deadline and hey, I got to finish. So I have to come up with some kind of conclusion. So that's what I wrote. And if I had to do that again, no, I don't think it does.
Right.
So.
Right. Now it's fun to watch the evolution that we go through as we write and publish, and even with this thing, I'm working on the second edition because I mean I look at an entire chapter 12. I'm like, all right, I'm just gutting that thing out, gutting it, replacing it. I've written most of the second version of the chapter now, changing a lot of other things in it, but it's just because if you're in this academic field, if you're constantly studying, you're constantly evaluating your own work that you've done and rethinking things, even your previous thoughts and beliefs, and always making them better and stronger. And sometimes we change our mind if we're good, careful thinkers doing our due diligence, and that's just part of the fun of the whole thing and the process.
If you're a careful thinker and somebody gives you a good objection, that should put you back a little bit or make you rework things or something like that. Right.
Well, hey, Phil, is there anything else you'd like to say about the ontological argument before we close things?
I would just say, if you're somebody who dismisses it out of hand, wants to hand wave it away, or just say something like, can't prove that doesn't work, then no, go study it in depth, because there's a lot more to it than that. And even if you come away and conclude, I think there's something still wrong here, the fact that you're studying it that way you're going to have to think about, as I said, all these different things, like what's the distinction between metaphysical and logical necessity? Why are there different types of necessity? How do all these concepts work? What does it mean for something to exist versus not exist? And all of those, studying all those things is going to make you a better thinker and a better philosopher, even if you do that for 5 years and then conclude, no, Phil is completely wrong. Well, still, you got benefit out of the study of it.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I like to say that too with the free thinking argument. So, I've been asked before, like, what if it turns out that you're wrong and you've spent 10 years now advancing this argument and defending it? And I'll be like, and I've said, well, I don't care. Even if I'm wrong about this, I've advanced the conversation forward. Somebody's gonna have to do a lot of hard work to show why I'm wrong and to show why they're right. And if they do that, then I'll jump on board with them. And because I'm more concerned with truth than I'm a particular argument.
And that's the way it should be. Yeah.
Right. That's also why it's frustrating to me to see those who consider themselves to be academic take argument. They take things so personally.
Sometimes.
And start attacking the other person. So I've had my character attacked. I've had my credibility attacked. I've had everything attacked. But just because they don't like my arguments.
Yeah. And even if you make a bad argument, that doesn't make you a bad person. I mean, ask my wife. I've made bad arguments all the time and she's still married to me. So
I can attest. My wife would say the same thing. So, well, anyway, Phil, thank you so much. You've sharpened me just in our few short interactions that we've had over the past few weeks.
Yeah.
And it was a blessing and an honor to listen to you at the EPS and to get to know you and to gain a new friend. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to working with you more in the future. So keep up the great work. Can people go anywhere to find out more about you and your work?
Well, I do have a podcast that, again, I haven't done much with for a while called The Examined Life with Phil. There's 94 episodes of it. As I said, I did a big push on the problem of divine foreknowledge. I've done some stuff with some of my essays there. I interviewed people about various positions Christians take on origin. So I interviewed a young earth creationist, an intelligent design guy, a theistic evolutionist, and I gave old earth creationism. Before the last election, I did a big thing on political philosophy. So I talked to people from various perspectives. And so, so there's 94 episodes. I was starting to do something on philosophy of story when I had to stop because the SBU asked me to come teach for them. And due to the way that all went down, I basically had to find and develop my own curriculum for the courses. So that was a lot of work. Not in the sense that I wrote my own stuff, but I had to go find books and do all the research and things. And that's just a lot of work. Now, I'm fine with that. It's rewarding. I enjoy doing it, but I had to stop doing the podcast for a little while for that reason. And hopefully I'll pick it up again soon.
Where can people find that podcast?
As far as I know, it should be available on all the major podcast services. You just do a search for The Examined Life with Phil, and it'll pop up. There's a Facebook page that I've called The Examined Life with Phil that's indexed pretty much all of those things. If you send me a message through that, I would get it. Okay. I am on Facebook as just Phil Kallberg, and so I do accept most friend requests, or you could just send me a message. I'm happy to talk to people about philosophy. The only thing is I've got a wife and 3 children, so I don't always have the time to respond to everything right away. But it's not because I'm trying to be mean or ignore you, if that's the case.
Well, thanks for not ignoring me today.
It was great meeting you at the conference, and I appreciate your kind words. So thank you.
Yeah, well, cool. Well, we will continue discussing things with each other, and I'm sure you'll be on this show again sometime soon. So let's stay in touch, brother. All right.
Likewise. You too, man.
All right. Well, in the meantime, everybody out there, stay reasonable and stay tuned. See you later.